Hi and welcome everybody to the second class of the course Permaculture Design Certificate. Today we're going to give you a little introduction into ecology, since the concept of ecology is introduced into our design and many design principles are also derived from ecology. So it's necessary for us first to dive into some principles of ecology, and that's what we're going to do in today's class. So first we will look at what is actually ecology. We will give you a little definition and then dive into one of the very important components of ecology that we think about: ecosystems. So first we need to define what is a system. And we look into systems theory and different concepts around systems. Then we'll see some different terms and other main components of what we need to know about ecology, like what are producers, what are consumers. For example, we will look into the material flows and energy next. Then we see last the theory of Gaia. And then, as you know, we have a look at our homeworks for this topic. So like I said, ecology is one of the cornerstones of permaculture. So what we do actually is apply principles and laws of an ecosystem to design. So we need to understand certain things that are happening on our planet. That's why the pictures here also. We will look at thermodynamics. We will look at moonlight, sunlight, winds, all kinds of dynamics we see in nature. We see soil processes, we see all kinds of life and food chains. We have to understand all of these things to then come up with designs that try to imitate ecology. And that's what we understand as ecological design. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about ecology? And that term is not falling from the sky. It's coming from Greek. It's actually made from two words specifically, which are oikos, home, also oikonomia, economy, same origin, home or house, defines a certain space, and logos, translated as study or treatise. So what we're talking about here actually is the science that studies living beings, the environment, distribution, abundance, and how these properties are affected by the interaction between organisms in the environment and with it. So we always look at a certain space, and like you can see, we study living beings, all kinds of living beings, from land living beings to animal, soil, things we see, things we don't really see with our own eyes, although we know their existence, like microbes, for example, all that little critters that we see in soil, on water, or even when we talk about microplastics and the phytoplanktons. It's also part of the food chain and the trophical chain, and we see how plastic and the petrochemical components we talked about last time already get into our ecosystem, and by that affect us. And that's why we see also later on we're all part of systems and we all interact within that system. So that's first we need to know which area we're talking about. We need to identify which are the elements within that and then analyze the interactions. That leads me to the first point on our long list for today's topics. We see the system theory, and well, we see this fellow that's not around anymore. He's called Ludwig von Bertalanffy. He's a German biologist, and he was one of the first ones to come up with a proper theory about systems. I mean, many people might have talked about systems before, but he came up with a systems theory, and we know how science works. First you have a couple of hypotheses and you build up a system around them and modeling, and then finally come up with a theory, all starting from research questions to hypotheses, coming up with a theory and models at the end, which still have to be tested. But we already know, in science everything is valid until proven otherwise. And well, system theory has been around for a while, so we can somehow have some confidence in its reliability. Yeah. So let's look at some points and some definitions around system theory here. We see that the concepts of system theory refers to a set of interdisciplinary contributions that have the objective of studying the characteristics that define systems, that is, entities formed by interrelated and interdependent components. Well, that's one definition. And like I said, it was, the German biologist which actually coined the term for the first time. We now see that there's different types of system. We look at some later. We also define between closed and open or isolated systems, and we see like a hierarchy between systems, supra systems, and subsystems. Very important to know the differences. So imagine the planet. We have the planet is the highest system, our supra system. And within that, we have all kinds of subsystems. And when we look at this definition here, it becomes clearer. We see systems that can be divided according to the level of complexity. So a small unit, the house or the human body, although it's complex, but compared the body to universe, we can distinguish that subsystem from the bigger system. Even within the body, the human body, you have different systems, like the respiratory system, the digestive system, and so on. So even there, and then we go into the cells, there's systems, and so on. So the different levels of system interact with each other. There's always some kind of edges and borders that we cross or not, but at least they're tangent to each other, so that they're not independent of each other. That's really important. This interrelatedness of different systems is apparent. So that's why we speak of subsystems. For example, a family is a system, and each individual in it is a distinct subsystem. The suprasystem is the external environment to the system in which it's immersed. In human systems, it's identifiable with society. So we are always part of society, or even going further, we're part of this planet, of the universe, of the spirit maybe. So this is something we have to be taking into consideration. So now we see there's different types also of systems. We divide between open, closed, isolated systems. So when we look at the open system, this one has a permanent relationship with its environment, exchanges energy, matter, and information, has a constant interaction between the systems and the environment. Good examples: the forest, a river, or an animal. Obviously, we can see this going through and through. Let's take the advantage of the animal. Constant energy exchange, input, output, constantly composing, using that energy, and completely connected to its nature. So this is a good example of an open system. Closed systems, in turn, they do not have any kind of exchange with the environment that surrounds them, and therefore they're hermetic to environmental influence. They can either simply be closed, or they can be isolated. So just because we have a closed system doesn't mean that nothing happens. We see that especially the heat component is the one we use also to distinguish simply closed to an isolated system. In this picture, it becomes much, much clearer. Let's start here with the open system. And we have two glossaries here, or let's say explanatory notes. The red arrows is the exchange of energy, and the blue ones is the exchange of matter. And here in the open system, we see that both are happening. We both have exchange of organic matters, and we have energy exchange. In a closed system, we don't have any material in or outflow, but energy exchange. That's really important. The energy exchange is basically always happening, no matter if it's a closed or an open system. The only one where it doesn't happen is the isolated system. When you think maybe of a hermetic insulation, yeah, that's a good example of an isolated system. Neither heat or other energy can circulate, come in or out, and obviously no materials can come in and out. So when we look at those, we see the differences. Our designs are naturally open systems because we have obviously lots of material in an outflow or exchange of matter. Yeah, just by thinking of all the organic materials that are brought onto your site just by the wind. So there's always going to be an exchange. Or you have birds coming in and out. You have all kinds of other animals and species coming in and out. So just from that perspective, you have lots of openness there. Yeah? Whether we want to closely part it, okay, so we would like to maybe prevent energy outflow in certain amounts, or we try to recycle energy as much as possible. We're trying to minimize the residual waste. We have the principle of create no waste. Next class, we're going to look more into the principles and ethics again. So we do have lots of exchanges, but we want to restrict maybe certain outflows, loss of energy. We don't want to waste any sunlight. We don't want to waste any water. We don't want to waste wind energy or just misuse it or have a destructive force. So we have lots of energy exchange. So that's why we have energy analysis. We have to look at all different kinds of energies on our system. And naturally, we have lots of material in an outflow. And this is where we can create a big difference to standard design or standard agriculture, where we have huge intake, big outtake, but it's not really related. In permaculture, instead, we want to create circles so that the material exchange is kind of in a circle way, pretty similar to nature and ecosystems, where we're going to talk about later. So for this fellow, the German biologist Bertalan Fee, strange name even for me as a German, hard to pronounce, so don't be surprised if it's difficult for you. The basic criterion that defines a system is the degree of interaction with the supersystem and other systems. So this is pretty clear. Let's repeat. Open systems, they exchange matter, energy, and information with the environment. In contrast, closed systems, theoretically isolated. In practice, we speak of closed systems when they're highly structured and feedback is minimal, since no system is completely independent of its supra system. And we saw that the energy exchange happens at least in a closed system too, unless it's a fully isolated, hermetically isolated system. So let's look more at the properties of an open system, because what we deal with in practice will be more the characteristics of an open system. So first, we look at totality or synergy, meaning the operation of the system cannot be understood only by the sum of the elements that compose it, but the interaction between them generates a qualitatively different result. To put it in numbers, it's just as simple as 2 plus 2 is not always 4, maybe 5 or 6 or even more. Because here we don't sum each element and then say, okay, that's the totality of the system. No, because those two elements, sticking with the 2 by 2 elements, two objects are interrelated. So already 2 arrows from each to each, already giving us lots of permutations here. So it's more than just 4. Mathematically, we can also show that not by summing it up. Maybe summing up is not the right additional operation. Maybe we look more at permutations or mutations interactions. Harder to maybe imagine, but mathematically it's pretty straightforward. Here on the right hand side, we can already see it in a coral reef. We've learned already that agriculture systems are highly productive, and here we can see high diversity, and we see that there's lots of interactions. So we see that there's maybe 100 fish, but the interactions of these fish are multifold. We see lots of elements they can interact with, not even to talk about those that we don't really see. So have in mind that there's invisible structures, patterns, and so on that animals and living beings follow, which are quite invisible. Something we'll talk about later too. Circular causality or reciprocal codetermination. Two more terms that we have to have in mind. This is referring to the action of the different members of the system that influence that of the rest, so that the behavior of none of them is independent of the system as a whole. In addition, there's a tendency for the repetition of operating patterns. So basically saying nothing's an island, nothing is standing for itself, so everything affects everything basically. This reciprocal means going towards ways or different ways. That means reciprocal, and codetermination also means that the parts, agents, elements, animals, people, living beings, they all determine the outcome. So it's not just some kind of invisible hand that is structuring everything ultimately, probably, but in particular here, everybody plays their role. So this is what means codetermination. So if you take away certain elements of the ecosystem, the whole outcome is affected. So that's why we are so concerned about the loss in biodiversity, because we don't know what happens if, for instance, all the bees are extinguished, or what happens if all the whales are extinct. What happens? We've seen massive extinctions already, and as we talked about also last video, facing the next great extinction. And what are the consequences for the ecosystem if we take out those elements? We don't know really, and that's a big danger. We see right now the pandemic of coronavirus we've seen, we are seeing, depending on when you watch this video. So this is a good example. Now we take away habitat, something we learn about later, living room for certain species. We take that away. Maybe the species still exists, so where do they go? Maybe they're looking for a new host. So that's why we also see how certain diseases spread from animals to humans, not because humans may be going into places where dangerous animals are living. No, to the contrary. We take away their space and we're just there where the animals are. Another principle, it's equifinality, basically meaning always lead to Rome. If we want to stick with this idiom, here you see some kind of a labyrinth. We have many different entrances and probably always finally end up in the middle. Here meaning you can have different departing times, points, places, and they all finally converge maybe to one spot. Equicausality is the opposite, which means we can all in the end up in different spots, although we depart from the same. So it's basically the inverse of previous statement. So we see both happening in open systems. One thing that I mentioned earlier, talking about patterns and invisible structures already a little bit. Limitation or stochastic process. Certain systems, they tend to develop to certain sequences of operation and interaction between members. Let's look at the savanna. We think about maybe all the birds. When you're living in a cold place, maybe in the northern hemisphere, you see that we have migrating birds. They fly out when it gets colder and come back in spring. So this is something that happens all the time. Those are certain sequences of operation and interaction. According to those pre-established patterns, there's certain feeding rituals or feeding patterns, drinking patterns, all kinds of patterns that we keep observing. And then, once those patterns are established, it's highly unlikely that those patterns just disappear. For example, if in Africa, elephants and antelopes or all these animals that also wander in certain periods of the year to maybe drink, they're looking for water, they all eventually go to the same spot to look for the river every year without anybody telling them. They just do it by nature, so quote. So this is quite important for us to have in mind when we talk about systems. Although they're open, although there's lots of exchange, there's still lots of stability. And all this interaction, which seems to be chaotic, in the end converges or has tendency also towards harmony. We have the so-called relationship rule. Now this one determines which are the priority interactions between the components of the systems and which should be avoided. Another case for us as designers, really important, the principle of relative location, for example, where we really look where is a certain element situated, and then look what are the different interactions and that we want to, beneficial interactions and negative interactions that we're trying to avoid. So this rule for us as designers becomes really important when we decide where to put things. Another principle, very important for ecosystems, so-called hierarchical ordering. So maybe we as humans, we don't like hierarchies too much. Even more now, newer generations, maybe even less. Certain cultures, they do like hierarchies a lot. Other cultures, they don't like them at all. It's also a cultural thing. In nature, everything has its pre-established place. You can also say maybe God-given place. Everything is designed by purpose, and that's how it should be. And we as designers should understand those hierarchies and build designs accordingly. One important hierarchy for us is the food chain, and when we know that, for example, that most life starts maybe with some microorganisms in the soil, like my friend Miguel is always mentioning, that we're actually not cultivating food, we're cultivating microorganisms, basically. That's what we're feeding. We're not feeding the plants, we're feeding the soil. We're feeding all these little microorganisms in the soil. And because why? Because we know the hierarchy. We know everything starts in the soil. So that's where we start. Teleology means the development and adaptation of the system, or teleological process occurs from the opposition of homeostatic forces, that is focused on maintaining balance and the current state, and morphogenetic focus on growth and change. Not to mess up with theology, which me pronouncing, I always have a hard time differentiating between those words. I guess you won't have a big problem. So we're talking about dynamic processes. One term that we maybe easily use many times when we talk about ecosystem. Everything is an ecosystem. Companies are an ecosystem. Humans are an ecosystem. So all of a sudden everything becomes an ecosystem. Is this true? Is everything really an ecosystem? Maybe, yet everything is a system. We've seen it already. You and I, the humans, where we live. So everything can be basically defined in some way or the other as a system. Okay? Let's look at this definition of ecosystem in particular. An ecosystem is an ecological system where the components that make it up interact and
coexist with each other. An ecosystem is made up by living beings or biotic factors, as well as abiotic factors or the physical environment. We see now a bit more in detail what are those two components. Abiotic factors are those that allow the survival and development of the natural life cycle and living beings, so that it can include sunlight, water, natural nutrients, soil, temperature, and humidity. Biotic factors are living beings and are classified as follows: producing organisms, consuming organisms, and decomposing organisms. Let's look at those a bit later in the trophic chain or in the food chains. Yeah, here in ecosystems we have so-called food chains. In these chains, living beings eat each other under the hierarchy. So by many people maybe also being misused, especially now in capitalism. We say, hey, nature is like that, survival of the fittest. That's also in some cultures the common nature or the common culture. We say we have a certain hierarchy, maybe from religion. Man has been based above all living beings, something people discuss. So we already see the concept of hierarchy and how that affects also our conduct and behavior. Yeah, and again, we talked about this invisible structures. It has been like that for millennia. So we take it as a given, maybe. Also to eat meat, things like that. Personally, everybody's choice whether to eat meat or not. We learned that it's not necessarily a question of sustainability whether we eat meat or not. Anyways, again, another discussion. So let's keep that in mind. So there's a being that each eats another and in turn serves as food for a third individual. So again, nothing's an island, everything's interrelated. There's therefore a relationship between prey and predator in a chain that is called a food chain. This is probably the most important element of an ecosystem. So have that in mind. When we design ecosystem, keep in mind what are the food chains. The relationships that are established in this chain, trophic relationships, because we're talking about the trophic chain, allow the cycle of energy and the cycle of matter to exist. If it wasn't like that, where's the organic material coming from? Okay, we mentioned the wind that maybe brings something onto your property. But we're talking more about animals eating herbs, plants, fruits, and other animals eating animals, and critters, they eat each other, and then they die, and they decompose, and all of this cycling is what we're talking about. So this means that each of the organisms that are part of the chain constitute a link or a trophic level. So we're talking here also about hierarchies. We have also like pyramid, and we talk about the trophic chain. In many traditional representation, it is pictured as a chain, as a pyramid. Sorry. Although people also discuss that if that's the most appropriate way to visualize it, because maybe it's more of a cycling rather than a pyramid. Yeah, that's just an optical representation. So now we're going into the topic of material and energy flows. Here we see the birdie looking at the squirrel and thinking, yummy food. And the squirrel maybe is just thinking of, hey, up there, yummy nuts. So everything happening normally, but everybody's interrelated. So all living beings that inhabit an ecosystem need matter and energy to carry out their vital functions and thus develop their life cycles. And we see in nature, and maybe you're also one of the fans of those National Geographic productions and understanding all what animals do. I really like to watch these movies a lot nowadays, not so much time anymore. But when I was a kid, I loved watching documentaries on animals and all the different strategies they have. And it's quite funny how they have different energy strategies, basically. So the living beings in an ecosystem are grouped into trophic levels to the way in which they obtain matter and energy. So this is a way science categorized all the living beings by the way in which they obtain matter and energy. It's just a decision science did back in the days. You can maybe think now of other ways to group living beings. Yet, like I said earlier, all theories and models exist as long as they've been falsified. So has been around for a while. So probably has something very interesting for us to carry. Here we differentiate between producing organisms, consuming organisms, and decomposing organisms. Let's look at the so-called producers or primary producers, which are understood as any living being capable of producing its own food. Bacteria and mainly plants are part of this group. So focus. Producers, they provide for their own needs. So that's why we say we need to become producers. Stop being consumers, become a producer. Well, that's a whole different discussion, yet a very important point. We have the so-called consumers, which are those that depend on others to survive, mainly animals, but also some fungi and parasitic plants. Then our best friends in the garden, best friends in the soil, our decomposing organisms that are turning complex organic molecules into simpler molecules. Bacteria and fungi are the main organisms in charge of decomposition. And like I mentioned earlier, we don't really feed plants. We feed those microorganisms, and those feed our plants, and those maybe feed our animals or us, and so on. Yeah? So it's very important to understand who does what and how can I help them to do their job better so I have to work less. That's probably an interesting observation for you too. A nice graphic from Encyclopedia Britannica. We have it here nicely visualized, how we have producers on the very bottom. Again, you see a hierarchy. You can maybe visualize in different ways. There's many people that don't like the idea of hierarchies and pyramids, yet it's still very, very easy to understand. We have the producers or primary producers. Remember, those that can basically produce their own food in a way or live in a self-sufficient way. Then we have the primary consumers, secondary and tertiary consumers. So we see also the consumers get bigger basically, yeah, and obviously more energy is transmitted and more organic material is exchanged. Okay. So let's look at the movement of the energy matter within an ecosystem. We talked about catching and storing energy, or we will talk about that in many ways, and that's why it's important to understand where's the source of everything. Many times we can say it's the sun. That's why there's also many rituals based on the sun, or water or soil, because those are the components we need here. Okay, so let's look at solar energy, which is absorbed and fixed in matter through photosynthesis by the producers components of the base of the trophic chain. The energy fixed by the photosynthesis process is only 0.1 to 1% of the total amount of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface. So we're not very efficient when we're only catching sunlight with plants, although it's one way, we might think of others. This energy, together with the matter in the form of biomass, is transferred into the following trophic levels until reaching higher levels with an efficiency of between 10 to 20% between one level and another. So the energy within that ecosystem dissipates as it moves through the ecosystem. That is, it gradually releases the environment at each trophic level in the form of heat through the process of cellular respiration. These energy losses between the different trophic levels limit the length of the trophic chain and the biomass that will reach the higher trophic level. Okay, so these interactions have a determining role. In this way, flow of energy, how to go from one level to the other, in an ecosystem is unidirectional. That is, it moves in a single direction from the producer to the higher trophic level. Although, that's why I say, ultimately, who's eating the dead bird at the top? So that's again then the decomposes. So it goes back to the beginning. On the contrary, the matter that results from each trophic level accumulates in the soil and remains at disposal of decomposing organisms that, in turn, they also release energy in the form of heat to the environment. That's why we have a compost bin. You can use that compost bin to heat other things, like the greenhouse we talked about. These decomposers are responsible for transforming this organic matter and returning it to the environment in form of inorganic matter, which will be used again by autotrophic organisms to enter the trophic web. Therefore, a closed matter cycle and unidirectional energy flow are distinguished. One of the characteristics of the flow of energy in the most important ecosystems is that, on one hand, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It only transforms, and that, on the other hand, this change in shape entails the loss of energy in form of heat. So that's why we always say in nature nothing is lost. That's why we don't like things like plastic, because it never really goes back into the cycle. It always stays, never really goes back. But everything else mainly has a way to go back to where it came from in a different way. For me, a tree is a really good example. Look at the tree that is catching a lot of sunrise, a lot of sunshine during its lifespan. Yeah? Lots of leaves, also lots of wood is produced during the course of time. So then, sadly, one day maybe it gets cut down, and then the energy, is it lost? No. If you light that piece of wood, you know how much heat comes out of that? So where is it coming from? It's not just gone. It was stored in that trunk. But then again, where's it going? It's going somewhere, but this is what it means here. This transforming process creates heat. But it's not just gone. Later on we have ash, right? And that ash goes back into the soil. And then from that soil, maybe it feeds other living species. And again, it's just transformed and never really gets lost. The only way that it's somehow disappearing is the heat. So that's why we make here a big distinction. We can look at it in a visual way. Again, here we have the producers, we have main consumers, then also these consumers, eventually they will die and get back to the soil, where then the microbes taking care of it and decompose it into different elements. But we also see that other elements enter in our ecosystem, maybe things we don't want, from burning fossil fuels or other materials we don't really want in our chain, or other inorganic materials like limestone and other materials, that when we see the soil creation or formation process, we see the importance of these materials. Yeah, let's go through some more terminology. One is ecotone. This is meant to be the transition zone between two different ecosystems or ecological boundaries. We will talk about the edge effect or maximizing edges, and why is that so? This is one example which makes it pretty clear. Why do we want to increase the maximum toning? Basically, we want to tone our design, ecotone. Because what we see here actually on the right hand side are two different ecosystems. There you see one with black and white dots. You have the one with the black and white squares. So those are the two ecosystems. And those are interacting at their borders, the tone or the edge. And here we have overlapping some basically, or elements, and we see everything is mixed. And then when you look at the bottom, the number of species in zone A is lower, in the middle it's high, and on the tails again it's lower. So this shows that at the border, the edge of the ecotone, there's a high amount of diversity. So this is what we talk about when we talk about edges and things like that. Think about the change from day to night. Lots of birds are singing. Think about the same edge in the savannah. Animals go hunt. In the ocean, if you're surfing, don't go surfing in the morning. It's when the sharks are going hunting. Or at night, same thing. Sunrise and sunset surfing, the most favorite surfers. They like that stuff. But when you live in a place where there's sharks, you rather think about it. Many people, they maybe go swimming in the morning. Lots of stuff happens. It's also for that reason. Or they also mentioned, don't surf in a river mouth. Why? In that river mouth, there's so much that fish. So the sharks, they come from the ocean, go to that ecotone because there's a high amount of food for them. And that's why people say, hey, don't go surfing there. That ecotone, it's like surfing on a shark's dining table. Then leg accidentally ends up in your mouth. Well, bad luck, yeah. Sorry. So this is basically the concept of ecotones. Very important, very, very important. Another one, also very important. I mean, everything is important talking about here, that's for sure. But seriously, those two are very, very important. When we talk about the ecological niche, that also then explains why certain weeds come up. It's not that there's weeds because someone just wants to bully you, just to get on your nerves, like, why is that weed coming out there, or that bamboo growing there, or that plant that I can't rip off, all these grasses and all that stuff that I can't get out of the soil. But why is it there? Because in that specific spot, that specific plant has a specific advantage over another plant. So it conquers that so-called niche. Niche, also terminology known from the market, from economics. Niche products are those which are small and tiny, and they say, I found my niche. Like organic, vegan, leather-free shoes, sneakers for skaters, for example. Very specific, very small, very well defined. In terms of business strategy, sometimes a good strategy to go towards that niche. In the ecosystem, similar. So let's look at the definition. The concept, the concept of an ecological leaf has evolved, always controversial, and has evolved over time. It's frequently confused with other concepts such as habitat and biotope. It refers to the function, role, and response that an animal or plant species fulfills in a habitat, taking into account biotic factors and abiotic factors. So the ecological niche is the function that each species exercises within a certain ecosystem. For example, there are pollinators, predators, scavengers, decomposers, distributors, and many more. Like we just saw the example of wheat, we also see same things in animals, all those things that have evolved over time, and they found their right spot. We can differentiate between different types of niches. We have one is the fundamental niche and the effective niche or real ecological niche. Let's look at the fundamental one. This is a niche in which a species would be able to survive without taking into account interactions with other species. The effective niche refers to the conditions and resources that allow a species to maintain its stable population. Okay. Like it said, don't confuse it with the term habitat. Home is where my habitat is. Not really. So this is the place where all these organisms live. But let's look at the more precise definition. It's the place whose conditions are suitable for the life of an organism, species or communities, be it an animal or plant. Like I said, it's a place where we live, whether it's an animal or all kinds of other living beings. That's their habitat and their usual habitat. Like according to that animal, what habitat suits it. Let's go back to the chart. Do you think the savanna is a good habitat for a shark? Do you think the forest is a good habitat for the shark? So habitat is depending on the thing that we're talking about. So as such, habitat comprises a set of abiotic factors as well as biotic factors that create the right environment for the life of a number of species, both animals and plants, and that may or may not include the human factor. So these factors, they could be, if we talk about a pond, for example, for fish, so there's certain fish that like warm water, cold water, salt water, fresh water, shallow water, deep water, and so on. There's thousands of factors often defining an optimal habitat, and that's what we're talking about. We have a high loss in biodiversity. Why? We have a high loss in habitat through deforestation, polluting, and just taking away the habitat of other species that are sharing the same amount of space on this planet. And that's the problem we're facing. So this is another concept. I mentioned it many times. Here comes the definition for it: biodiversity. We hear it a lot of times. So what does it actually mean? Biodiversity or biological diversity is the variety of life. This recent concept includes several levels of biological organization. It encompasses the diversity of species of plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms that live in a given space. Their genetic variability, ecosystems of which these species are a part, and landscapes or regions where the ecosystems are located. It also includes the ecological and evolutionary process that occur at the level of genes, species, ecosystems, and landscapes. Okay. So, to round it out with the theory of Gaia, everything is connected. And also other people talk about Gaia's internet. Yeah, it's really amazing how in a forest or in an ecosystem, plants actually communicate via their roots. So they also have a router, basically, and they talk through fungi that maintain some kind of information. So it's really interesting how like trees can be infected at the edge of the forest, for example, with a certain fungi, and other trees further away from that already develop antibodies against that fungi, although never having been in touch with that. Why is that so? That trees yards away from the trees that are infected know about that disease. No one's telling them, basically. Yeah, interesting. You can even look. There's a BBC article on it. Maybe I can find it for you. And obviously, there's scientific studies around it. How plants are communicating with each other. It's really crazy. Like as if they had an internet and they were sending emails to each other. It's really crazy. I promise you, it's funny. And I'm really stoked by that. And that's why really nothing we do in the garden, in our design, in nature, is independent of the impact, basically. So according to Gaia's theory, the Gaia hypothesis is a set of scientific models of the biosphere in which it is postulated that life fosters and maintains suitable conditions for itself, affecting the environment. According to the Gaia hypothesis, the atmosphere and the surface, part of planet Earth, behave as coherent whole where life, its characteristic component, is in charge of self-regulating its essential conditions, such as temperature, chemical composition, and salinity in the case of oceans. So nature somehow is smart enough to regulate everything else. Personally, I don't think it's nature somehow funnily doing everything. For me, there's something higher than that. Yet here we study nature and we're observing. That's what we do, and we're trying to find out what are the connections behind them. We don't necessarily pose the question, why is everything there? Yet, an important question to ask. That's part of another class. Okay. This theory also states that it's all tending or converging towards a self-regulating equilibrium, stable point where all these interactions somehow find a stable interaction pattern. Doesn't mean that it doesn't grow. It can still grow, but in a stable pattern. Okay, so this is basically the theory of Gaia. I invite you to look it up a bit more. And with this, we'll finish more or less the session of today. You will still have a look at the homeworks for this topic. Here we have another impressive picture showing the planet as the eye, or basically as part of a human body. And it is true. The oceans are compared to organs, the lungs are compared to organs, the soil is compared to an organ. If you have more questions on that, don't hesitate to write us an email and ask, what organ is actually the soil? What organ is actually the ocean? And I know my friend Miguel, he's a biologist, he'd be happy to answer you all those questions. Just for me, I keep myself with a metaphor that all function as a system. The body has systems, so the ocean has systems. It's like an organ of the body. And as we know, as soon as one organ gets sick, it's really likely that the whole body gets sick. I mean, no person can live long with a sick stomach. No person can live long with a sick lung, sick kidney, or sick brain. I mean, that's quite obvious. Same happens to planet Earth, and if we keep treating it as if it wasn't a living being or ecosystem or system, eventually everything will get sick. So do we. So it's not in our philanthropic interest to save the planet because we are such nice people. No, you could really boil it down to it's the most effective and best strategy for our own rescue, basically. So with this, we want to say bye-bye and guide you into your homeworks. Second module, second topic. First idea is to observe and describe and draw a food chain or part of it, and it can be from your own garden, orchid, or environment in which you live. You don't have to have obviously everything written down, but maybe you just look at one certain element and write down a food chain. You can make it a picture, you can make it just in words with arrows or whatever you feel like. Don't feel stressed out by it, but take your time doing those. Second one, if you have a compost bin, describe some decomposers that live in it. Describe them, name them if you can. If you don't have a compost bin yet, look for one or more organic matter in your surroundings. You can also observe these organisms in most superficial levels of soil in the garden or field that does not have, quote, clean soil. Third, collect a bucket of organic waste from the kitchen, organic materials, bury it about 20 centimeters deep. If you don't know what centimeters is, just Google inch to centimeters and you'll find it. In 2 weeks or so, dig it up and see what decomposers are there. How does it smell? Something you might be afraid of in the beginning. You might see some wonders how the compost from bad smell can turn into yummy smelling soil. Sometimes it's just as easy as maybe adding more nitrogen or more carbon, depending on what kind of smell you might have. And what indication is that for? Or low carbon, and so on. We don't go into detail yet. So what has decomposed first? Write down your observations. Number 4, if we consider your home as a system, explain what type of system it would be, what would be some of the subsystems it contains, and what would be its suprasystem. You remember the differences. How do you make your home system balanced or regulated in terms of these factors? So list some abiotic and biotic factors of your home system. Example, abiotic temperature factor is imposed by the environment in which the house is located. Okay. Number 5, sit in a garden close to home if you have a garden. If not, sit on your terrace, sit in your park, better an urban garden, or on the terrace or window, also worth it. Observe the ecosystem and describe some of its biotic factors, ecological niches, such as habitat, etc. Repeat this action the following months and if possible in the next season, and analyze the changes you observe in terms of the same factors that you have described above. Already indicating you that we need time where we design, and that's why we always talk about the famous 1 year minimum on the spot to know our surroundings. Okay, with that, I can just say thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the class. I did. See you live in our tutorials. Talk to you soon. Stay safe and stay tuned.